All right, so we've got our player character set up. I'm using Shay. The next thing I want to do is go over how to, replace this test NPC with characters that actually look like characters. So first off, I'm going to just use the existing Shay model I have because I know that it has this like scale problem. So it'll help us kind of go through the steps that would be involved with that and practice it. Before I get started, I'm going to rename this Shay to Shay parentheses player because it's my player character. And, remember if you expand it, you can see I added the player character prefab as a child of Shay. That's why it works. The NPCs are going to be set up very similarly. So I'm going to go into my character models directory here. So assets, models, characters. And I'm going to, let's drag two of them. I'll use the Xbot and I'll use a Shay. But you could pick anything you've downloaded from Mixamo, right? I'll go through one more and I'm going to add this guy to my scene because I think he'll work in my zombie idea. So starting with Xbot, who's scaled correctly, I'm going to go into my assets and go back into prefab. So this is where the player character prefab was. It's also where this NPC prefab should be. And I'm going to drag the NPC prefab onto the Xbot character. And it should just kind of be set up. So right off the bat, if I were to run the game, I can go over here and see that Xbot is playing an idle animation. And if I walk up to it, it asks me if I want to interact. Xbot is playing barks and kind of cycling through some variations or flourishes of the idle animation. If I hit spacebar, I talk to it, I can say goodbye. It's exactly the same conversation that was here. Same barks as well. So if you have a model that's scaled correctly, it's that easy. You just add the NPC prefab onto it. Now, it's worth noting that with Xbot, we've already set that character model up, right? It's already set up to use the humanoid rig. So if you have a new model from Mixamo, you're going to have to remember that step. I'll review it in a second when I use my construction worker dude. I do want to kind of go over, well, let's set up Shay, and then I'll go over some of the parameters after I've set up these three characters. So Shay is scaled wrong. So before I add the NPC thing to her, I'm going to go ahead and adjust her scale, which was something like 0.51 we decided in the previous video. Looked basically correct. And now I'm going to go back and find my NPC prefab. So assets prefab, and there is NPC. And I'm just going to drag this onto not my player version of Shay, but my NPC Shay. So I could actually click once and click again slowly after that to get the rename prompt going and call this Shay NPC. And you could also right click and hit rename, or you could click on it and then change the name in the inspector too. Okay, so now Shay should be set up in theory, but it's a little trickier because remember, because of the scale issue, much like we had to deal with our player character, now this thing has been shrunk down to 0.5 or whatever because the parent object is shrunk to 0.5. So rather than do that, I'm just going to delete this NPC, drag one just right into the scene. This is it scaled normally. And now I'm going to drag it onto my Shay NPC. And then I'm going to, so now it's scaled right and it's a child of Shay, but it's not positioned correctly. It's like offset way over there. So like if I move Shay, you can see this thing is going to move with Shay, but it's not lined up correctly. So again, We click on the NPC game object there. The scale is good, but the position needs to be changed back to 0, 0, 0, which will recenter it. And then so now we have the Shay NPC correct. And last but not least, let's set up the construction worker man. So since it's been a while since I've used Mixamo, like, you know, and measured in a days or long hours, I guess, it's reset itself. And if I were to download him, it will just ask me to download the character, which is what I want, right? So this would be perfect. But the first time I downloaded this, I had already like been looking at animations. Let me clear out my search here. So I don't know. Let's pick any animation here. And you know, at this point, once you have any animation, like I mentioned, you can't get out of animation. Not that I know of. I have no idea how to do it besides maybe if you log out and log back in, I'm not sure. So my workaround, like I mentioned, was to search for the T-pose and just use that. And then when you download it, you choose with skin, FBX for Unity. These leave all the same and hit download. And so I already have that downloaded. So I just need to import it into my project. So I'm going to find my models. So assets, models, characters. And I see Shay and Xbot. It's time to add this new guy who is character 17 non-PBR T-pose. So I don't know. I have mixed feelings on this. Like part of me wants to rename it like construction worker because then that's what a human would understand. But part of me wants to leave it similar to how it's named by default by Mixamo because that way, I guess if I ever wanted to remember which one it was, I could find it by its name on Mixamo. I don't know. It's dumb. I'm just going to rename it. So why don't I even just rename it beforehand? I'm going to call it construction. Actually, on Mixamo, his name is Pete. So I'm going to call him Pete. And I'm going to download that guy. I know this because... Oh, well, there it says character... I don't know. I swear it told me Pete once. I don't think I'm going crazy. Characters... Pete, yeah, see. But even though it says Pete, well, now it says Pete and not character, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. Mixamo is weird like that, I guess. Pete it is. So this Pete has the T-pose hung on because I didn't know how to get rid of it, like I mentioned. And I think that's going to make for a good example, just in case that happens to you. So I'm going to drag Pete into my scene, and just to review, we know how to fix this. We have to click on Pete. We have to go to Pete's Materials tab, and we need to extract his textures. So I want to extract the textures into my project's assets directory inside of the textures folder. And I'm going to make a new folder in here. I right-clicked, new folder, Pete textures. I don't know. I guess I'll just keep using lowercase first. And I got my Pete textures folder. I opened it up. I'm going to choose select folder to extract all the textures into there. And hopefully that just fixes them. If he has the weird... Okay, remember this normal map thing? You just always choose fix. And he seems good. He doesn't have the crazy eye transparency problem that some of the Mixamo models do. So I'm just going to quit while I'm ahead. If you remember, if you have weird, like you can see through parts of their face, you have to extract the materials after you've extracted the textures, and you need to change the transparency setting on that like we did on Shay. So you can go revisit that old video to see how we did that if you have one that's messed up. Okay, but Pete is working. So next, Pete is actually also scaled correctly, I would say. So I'm going to take my NPC prefab and just drag it onto Pete. and it works pretty good. Now let's say you have a character that's not the same body type. I tried to pick some settings that were going to be reasonable, but in case you needed to make a guy who's extra tall or extra wide or whatever, you can look at the capsule collider that's on this NPC prefab, and you could change its radius. You could change its height. And remember, if you change the height, you might need to change the center a little bit. This isn't really essential because these characters aren't really moving around so much like our player character is. It's basically just so the player understands when they're looking at it, and so the player can't just walk through it. So you need it to be reasonable, but you don't need it to be perfect. Whereas with my player, I kind of might want it to be more precise. Now, that should be good enough for talking to Pete. Let's just double check. He's playing animation. Ooh, look, he's not. I forgot. Remember this. When we get a new character model for the first time, there are some steps involved that I neglected to follow through with. So I go back to the rig on Pete, and I need to choose humanoid. So I just selected his model here, then I chose the rig tab, then I chose humanoid, and I leave everything else the same, and I hit apply. And maybe that's enough. Yeah, that works. So here's Pete. I can still talk to him. Cool. All right, so that's kind of like the basic setup. I'll go over some of the like nuances of the properties on this NPC game object that we've been adding to characters to turn them into NPCs. So we looked at the capsule collider. We talked about that. We kind of talked about the transform as just their position, but we wouldn't want to move the child NPC position, right? Because that is just going to move the NPC component here, not the actual character model. So we don't want to do that. This NPC script is like the main thing that makes it all work. And the key thing to know here is that we have these like idle flourish animations. And, you know, if we look at the animator controller here, and I open that up, I can see that it has 3 flourish idle variations. So there's one that has a high chance of happening, a medium chance, and a low chance. And these are just animation like flourishes to make it a little more interesting, so they don't just seem like they're standing there forever, never moving, like real people would fidget some and things like that. So this should, in theory, add a little realism. So if I click on these, I can see which animations they're using. So we have thoughtful head shake. If I go into the project window and click this, it'll find it for me, and I could click play. And you can kind of see it's pretty subtle. So that's what that would look like. So returning to this NPC game object on Pete, if I see the time between idle animation change rolls, that's how often it's going to do those flourishes. If you hold your mouse over it, you should get a tooltip. And if you just don't want to use the flourishes at all, you can just uncheck that. So if I want it to be changing really rapidly, I could reduce this time. I would warn you that you know, if you make it too fast, it'll look weird, especially with lots of characters. So you can play with it. Now here you see NPC generic A is the animator controller. I made a few variations here you could try. So Shay is going to be left on generic A. Let's change the construction man to nervous. So any of these here, if you click it and you click the little target thingy, you can see a list of all the animator controllers in your game. the ones that I made that are prefaced with NPC underscore should all work. You can't just pick anything or it might not work with the rest of the system. So we're going to make this guy use the nervous one. Shay will leave on generic. And the Xbot we will change to use toe tap. So you can see all three variations. So now if I hit play, they should all kind of look subtly different. So you can see he kind of has this different stance. And you can see them playing different flourishes there. And the flourishes have a min and a max time, so it randomly picks between, because if they all changed animations at the exact same time, it feels weird and robotic. So we want them to not be in sync. We want them all kind of feeling like they're on their own independent timing system here. So anyway, there you go. There's the three at a glance. So they're all playing the same barks. You can look at the bark on idle thing here to change the bark conversation, but I would recommend that you check out the bark tutorial for dialogue system. This is part of dialogue system to see how that works. We've covered all the stuff in the NPC script. The usable script is just a component that has to be added to things that you want to interact with. It's part of dialogue system also. What's interesting here is I can override the message. So I could do something like, let's go find Pete again. So on Pete's NPC game object here, I'm going to change his name to be Pete. Just a sec. Let's kind of see what that does just to test it out. I think if we're lucky. Well, it's not going to, I guess it's not going to, yeah, okay. See, it says Pete, spacebar to interact. And maybe spacebar to interact is not exactly the way I would want it to sound when I'm talking with a person. So I could say, space bar talk, something like that, right? It's a more descriptive verb, right? That makes it feel more like I'm doing something. So that's what the usable does. Again, you can look at the tutorials on dialogue system to see more about how this works. Dialogue actor is another thing that's part of dialogue system. So we could maybe one day make a Pete actor here and give him like a portrait and stuff like that. Can give him his own bark UI. Right now it's using the bubble template. This is all covered in dialogue system tutorials on the Pixel Crushers website. And the dialogue system trigger is what is telling, so we set it up, when does it get triggered on use? It's kind of connected to this usable component. And the main thing here to look at is what conversation is going to be played when you talk to this guy. So as soon as you start making new conversations, you would be wanting to change this for each of your NPCs. Yeah, so that's the overview here. With this, you can start creating a lot of different characters to populate your scene. So hopefully I didn't miss anything. If you have any questions, let me know. In a later video, I'll cover how to like customize the animations even further. But I think we should be more focused on like setting up the basics of our scene, like blocking out where the characters are, getting them all set up basically before we get carried away with like special animations. But I will go into that eventually. All right, thanks. I'll see you in the next video.